The 2005 NASCAR Nextel Cup Series season will be a season that will never be forgotten. Carl Edwards having one of the best rookie seasons ever, Kurt Busch being suspended, Roush having their greatest season, the wreckfest of a Coke 600, Rusty Wallace's retirement tour, Casey Kane finally scoring that first win, Jeff Gordon having his worst season ever. Tony Stewart would go down as the 2005 champion, but what if we removed the chase for the cup? Would he still be champion? Well, that'll be my job today to tell you. This is Breaking the Chase. The first 6 races would provide us with 5 different winners, with defending champion Jeff Gordon seeming to pick up right where he left off by winning his 3rd Daytona 500 and the 6th race at Martinsville. Greg Biffle would win the 2nd race at Auto Club, followed by Jimmy Johnson winning next week at Las Vegas. Carl Edwards would pick up his first career win by half a car length at Atlanta, then Kevin Harvick would end a 56 race winless drought at Bristol. After these 6 races, Jimmy Johnson would lead the point standings by 160 points to Greg Biffle, almost an entire race. Johnson would have a very consistent first 6 races with finishes of 5th, 2nd, 1st, 2nd, 6th, and 8th, making a 6-race top 10 streak to open the season. Over the next 6 races, Biffle would shrink the gap by 89 points to Johnson by outperforming him in 4 of the next 6 races. Biffle would dominate at Texas while Johnson finished 3rd to bring the gap down to 135 points. At Phoenix, Biffle's engine would overheat, forcing him to a 41st place finish, while Johnson would finish 15th, causing the gap to grow to 208 points. At Talladega, Biffle would finish 13th to Johnson's 20th to bring the gap back down to 187 points. At Darlington, Biffle would have redemption for Phoenix by winning the Southern 500, while Johnson finished 7th to shrink the gap again to 148 points. The next race at Richmond, Johnson would have a disastrous race by crashing out in the first 100 laps and would go on to finish 40th, while Biffle would have a solid outing by finishing 6th and for 3 races in a row would decrease the gap to 41 points. Johnson would barely win the Coke 600, while Biffle would finish 6th and grow the gap to 71 points after 12 races. Over the next 6 races, Biffle's gap to the top would grow despite winning 2 races and Johnson going winless. At Dover, Biffle would win and Johnson would finish 4th to bring the gap to 46 points. At Pocono, Johnson would finish 6th while Biffle would have a bad day finishing 30th and increase the gap to 123 points. At Michigan, Biffle would win while Johnson would finish 19th to bring the gap down to 49 points. At Sonoma, Biffle would finish 14th while Johnson would finish 36th to give Biffle the point lead by 22 points over Jimmy Johnson. The next week, the lead would change hands again with Johnson finishing 6th and Biffle finishing 36th and gave Johnson the lead back by 73 points. At the next race in Chicago, Johnson would finish 3rd to Biffle's 11th to increase the gap to 108 points. Tony Stewart in this time would put himself in the conversation by winning back-to-back races at Sonoma and Daytona and having very consistent finishes. But in the following 6 races, Stewart would separate himself from the rest. At Loudon, Tony Stewart would dominate and win to shrink the gap to Jimmy Johnson to just 85 points. Johnson would finish 13th in this race with Greg Biffle finishing 5th, closing the gap to 77 points. At Pocono, Stewart would finish 6th while Johnson would finish 12th, bringing the gap to 66 points. Biffle would finish 17th in this race and was now 87 points back in 3rd. The next race at Indianapolis would be the turning point in this whole championship battle. Tony Stewart would take the point lead with a very strong win, while Johnson would not have such fortunes.
Several changes on several stops, and there's trouble on the racetrack with Jimmy Johnson. The championship leader is around. Gordon gets by.
And he doesn't hit anything. I don't think.
I don't think he did either. He did
left front. The valence is pushed under just a little bit in front of the left front tire, but That might have been when he was going around and around. The spring is so soft it gets him down and drug the racetrack.
He spun here.
It's about 3 seconds behind these. Oh, trouble!
Championship leader Jimmy Johnson has tagged the wall. That'll bring out the caution.
More than tag the wall, perhaps.
Yes, sir. Blew up here, finished 36th a year ago.
He's knocked the fuel pump off the car and has some fire under it. I hope they're looking under the car.
This took Johnson out of the point lead and now 75 points behind Stewart. Greg Biffle would finish a mediocre 21st and was now third, 111 points behind. After taking the point lead at the Brickyard, Tony Stewart would establish himself as the championship favorite by dominating and winning the next week at Watkins Glen, and following up the consecutive wins with a 5th and an 8th, and was now 213 points above Jimmy Johnson and 224 points above Greg Biffle. Over the next 6 races, Tony Stewart would continue to assert his dominance over Biffle and Johnson. Jimmy Johnson would have 3 finishes outside the top 15, and despite picking up a win at Dover, he would lose 180 points, and would now be almost 400 points back in 4th. Greg Biffle and Tony Stewart would end up being the championship fight for the rest of the season. At Auto Club, Greg Biffle would finish 2nd and Tony Stewart would finish 5th to slightly shrink the gap to 209 points. At Richmond, Biffle would finish 3rd and Stewart 7th to chip away that gap to 185 points. At Loudon, Stewart would finish 2nd and Biffle would come home 4th to grow the gap back to 200 points. At Dover, Biffle would finish 13th while Stewart would finish 18th and decrease the gap once again to 180 points. At Talladega, disaster would strike for Craig Biffle.
12 lines up. We talked about this bump drafting thing. He wasn't lined up straight when he hit the 41 car. The 41 car was just a little bit to his left. You got to give him a straight shot. And this was coming through the tri-oval, which is another problem.
And the 16 car, another Nextel Cup point contender, involved in the crash.
As was Rusty Wallace in the 2.
This horrendous day would end up making Biffle finish 27th, 18 laps down, while Stewart would go on to finish 2nd, growing the gap to 278 points. At Kansas, Biffle would finish 2nd while Stewart would finish 4th, slightly decreasing the gap to 268 points. If Biffle was going to claim the title with 6 races to go, he would need to gain approximately 45 points per race on Tony Stewart. That is almost 15 positions per race. Biffle would have to hope for nothing short of a miracle to beat Stewart. At Charlotte, a miracle would come to Greg Biffle. Stewart would have a disastrous day, finishing 25th, while Biffle would finish 3rd and bring the gap down to 191 points. Next week at Martinsville, Greg Biffle would have a disastrous day, finishing 20th, while Stewart would finish 2nd, and increase the gap to 263 points. At Atlanta, Biffle would outperform Stewart by finishing 2 places ahead of him and bring the gap down to 255 points. Tony Stewart could possibly lock up the title 2 races early if he gained 57 points on Biffle. But he would not end up doing this, because he would finish 6th and Biffle would finish 20th, almost locking up the championship, and had 302 points over him. All Stewart had to do at Phoenix was finish 39th to lock up the championship. Biffle would go on to finish 2nd and Stewart would come home 4th and would lock up the championship a week early by having 282 points over Greg Biffle. Greg Biffle would go on to make a statement at Homestead by winning the season finale, but it didn't matter. Stewart had already won the championship. So either way, in 2005, Tony Stewart would claim his 2nd championship, but albeit in our timeline, much more dominant fashion. Now, how would the season narrative have changed? Tony Stewart, Greg Biffle, and Jimmy Johnson would have all been thought of as contenders at one point in the season, but would all come up 200 points short. Carl Edwards had a brilliant rookie season and would finish 5th in the final standings, but would not be thought of as a contender in 2005. Well, that'll do it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week for 2006.